Good evening, and welcome to Loving and Free. This is Anna Turner.
And Michael Toms.
And tonight our guest is Dr. Helen Wambach, a clinical psychologist on the faculty of John F. Kennedy University in Orinda, and who does full-time research on hypnotic regression. Welcome, Helen. It's nice that you could be with us.
I'm happy to be here.
I'd like to start with some basic questions. First of all, what is hypnotic regression?
Well, it's a good question. Basically, people come with concepts of what it's like to be hypnotized. I give them a relaxation technique. I take them into muscular relaxation, followed by intensive mental work, which tends to relax the muscles because you can't bother to pay attention to them. I then move them into relaxed images, and then I count them deeper, and I move them back in time. What this is called is, of course, a purely social matter. Some people would call it guided fantasy. Other people would call it suggestion. It seems simpler to call it hypnosis because that's what it's been called before. But a more exact definition I don't think is possible at this time in our understanding of how the mind works.
What's the purpose of this research? Why do you do this?
Well, the purpose is like climbing a mountain because it's there. People say fascinating things under this circumstance, things that they do not normally say. They experience things slightly differently than they do when they're in their normal waking consciousness. I don't know what its ultimate purpose is. I don't know whether it's useful or not useful as far as adjusting to here and now. All I know is that I'm a lot like someone who goes down in a cave because it's there and finds some fascinating stalactites and stalagmites and keeps exploring deeper and deeper in the cave just to see what's there.
You must have gotten some feedback from people, however.
Yes, on my workshops I ask for a follow-up form to be filled out 6 weeks later. So far I haven't sent out too many, haven't gotten many back. I've also had informal feedback from people who've been in the group. It seems to me that people's response to the experience rests a good deal on their current belief system and on the belief system of other people around them. As in most instances of so-called psychic events, we tend to forget them or ignore them if they in some way conflict with our worldview. The same seems to be true of the regression experience. Those people who are quite interested in it and have read a good deal about reincarnation are likely to get a very great deal out of the experience. Those who are idly curious and whose friends and family tend to think it's nonsense are likely to somewhat repress the material that emerges in the course of time. So, we have no miracle here, and we make no sudden converts. But it does seem to be an interesting way to explore further into the past life of yourself, and at a bare minimum, into the exciting world of your own imagination.
How does the knowledge of one's past life bear on one's present life?
Well, I think it bears a great deal on it, whether or not you believe there's an objective reality to reincarnation. Because I have found that the most surprising people are able to empathize very clearly with the opposite sex, with other races, to develop interest in performing skills that they're not at all consciously aware of. Again, regardless of one's belief system, the fact that a quiet, passive, middle-aged lady can be a bloodthirsty, life-loving warrior in the past for at least an hour on a Saturday afternoon says a good deal about the things that lie under the surface of our rather superficial ego identity.
How does one determine, let me play the scientist for a moment, how does one determine whether that's coming actually out of one's, quote, past life, unquote, or one's subconscious?
Well, of course, this is the central problem in researching reincarnation. There is the Ian Stevenson approach, which is to take little kids who talk about previous lives and then try to establish whether or not they actually know the village that they presumably came from in a past life. That is the approach that's been used most frequently. Then there's the Bridey-Murphy approach, which is to take one case, study it intensively for small things such as the price of bread in Dublin in 1819, and see whether the material that emerges can be in records of the past. I have tried this approach too, but I find it frustrating because if I can research the past, and if this material, such as the price of bread in Dublin, is known and recorded somewhere, then presumably telepathy or hearing about it when one was a young child and forgetting about it could explain the phenomenon as well as reincarnation. In facing this frustration of proving reincarnation in the real world, I've taken a somewhat different tack. I am collecting very large numbers of cases in specific time periods in the past, and I am checking data that the subjects don't realize I'm checking. I'm checking utensils, patterns on pottery. I'm checking types of skills used, weaving techniques. I'm checking foodstuffs used in various centuries and various locations. I am assuming that if I get at least 200 to 400 cases in each time period of people who do not consciously have the knowledge of what was commonly eaten, say, in the Aztec civilization, but I get 140 of them reporting the same type of foodstuffs, I think we're in a different level of proof.
Do you ever find that someone regresses to a point that is beyond recorded civilization or recorded history?
Well, of course, I specify the time periods on 2 of my trips. On the 3rd trip, I specify geographical locations. So, in that sense, I am orienting people to known time periods and known places. I do have some people, independent types, who, if I make a stray remark such as go where you like, tend to go to other planets or strange spots and see colors. So I have to be rather brisk and authoritative in order to keep people focused on historical time periods and known geographical areas.
What about Atlantis?
I chose Atlantis as one of the possible geographic areas on the grounds that nobody knows what they had to eat in Atlantis, and that very few people know, presumably, how they dressed in Atlantis, or the means of travel used in Atlantis. So I figured that if I got, say, 400 or 500 reported past life trips to Atlantis, and they tended to use exactly the same means of transportation, the same food, and the same dress, I would have something really interesting here. Why are all these people coming up with similarities? Now, of course, since Taylor Caldwell published her book, which she wrote when she was 12, I'm now going to have to research that and see if that might be contaminating my data. But as far as I know, no one has yet described these small artifacts of living from Atlantis.
What book is this, Taylor Caldwell?
I think it's called The Romance of Atlantis, and she wrote it when she was 12, and Jess Stern got a hold of the manuscript and gussied it up for publication now. I somehow can't bring myself to read it. I'm not very fond of Taylor Caldwell's fiction to begin with, and Taylor Caldwell at age 12 doesn't attract me much, but I figure I've got to do that if I'm going to find out whether her book is influencing the data I'm getting.
So Atlantis is one of the locations that you use.
It's one of the geographical locations.
Well, there's a great deal of disagreement as to where Atlantis was located. What have you found?
Well, I very authoritatively state it's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Whether it is or not seems much simpler than saying, find Atlantis.
I see. Do you ever find disagreement with that?
No, but I do find a good many people who want to go to Atlantis on the 3rd trip and then state so before we begin. I tell them to go to an image that is as vivid and attracts them the most. And very few people find themselves in Atlantis, no matter how much consciously they want to be there, because an image from another geographical area will attract them more, or they will get a blank when they come to Atlantis.
Well, do you ever find someone that has not been to Atlantis? I mean, it didn't exist in Atlantis.
Well, presumably, yes. I got quite a few people who don't have any images for Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I'm curious about. You give people the choice of going to one of 5 places, and one lifetime or one time period may light up. Why is that? Is there more of an affinity with this life, the personality in this life?
Well, you got me there. I guess you could speculate endlessly about why some people choose one and some another. I do find a tendency for people to choose the ones closest in time. For instance, on the first trip, there's a choice of 5 time periods, including 1850. And I do have somewhat of a preponderance of people choosing 1850. So at some level, there is a choice about which time period they might have the most information about in this life. To guard against that possibility that I was just getting regurgitated Western movies or Walt Disney shows, the second trip takes people to time periods where there is very little in our culture, at least, about those time periods. So it's a lot harder to simply come up with a scenario of something we've read or heard.
Like, for an example, what would those time periods be?
400 A.D., 800 A.D., 1000 B.C., and 2000 B.C. I also put in 1200, but there is some material in our culture about 1200.
We're talking with Dr. Helen Wambach, a psychologist on the faculty of John F. Kennedy University and a researcher into past lives through hypnotic regression. I'm curious, Helen, about the beginnings of all of this, your story. What brought you to this place?
Well, whenever you look back on your life, and when you're 50 as I am, there's a lot of life to look back on, you see many of the beginning notes that work into the theme that comes in the last movement of the symphony. I was trained as a Freudian psychotherapist. My internship was in the Veterans Administration, and I think one of the first things that intrigued me was a patient I had who was referred for a neurasthenic syndrome. Basically, he complained of a bad back, and he got a fairly large sum of money from the VA in order to maintain his bad back. He was a hopeless patient. They used to foist off hopeless patients on young therapists. Well, I got so bored hearing his everyday recital of his difficulties, I started asking about his dreams. This man had the most fantastic dreams I ever heard. He would sit in front of me, this rather boring, middle-aged man with a measured IQ of 80, and when I asked about his dreams, I got the myth of Hercules, I got the golden palaces of ancient Egypt, and I got signs of telepathy that I could not miss. This man would report a dream in which he was incorporating a dream I had had the night before. This opened up to me a completely different picture of the ego structure that I was taught to believe in, the Freudian ego structure. And I think from that date on, at a certain portion of my clinical skill lay in the fact that I realized that what people presented to me as their lives and their selves was just the tip of an iceberg. And the potentialities and the possibilities lying within each human individual continued to amaze and delight me through a 19-year career of doing therapy. I have never found that people are what they seem to be on the surface. I have never found the goal of psychology, which is to predict behavior, possible because of the infinite possibilities of each human personality. My interest in reincarnation may have stemmed from a personal experience that dates way back to my early adolescence and was later reinforced by other experiences. I had moved to New Orleans. I was only 13. I was walking in a black area of New Orleans, and a smell assailed me, and I suddenly found myself in what I would now call an altered state of consciousness. I was deeply aware that before I had worked with black people, I had a deep affinity for black people. And at the same time, I knew I had not been black, but I felt a very strong drive to complete a task that I had begun before, a relationship, a cause, a need to be with black people. I put this in the back of my mind, but as I look back on my life later, I spent 20 years in the South, a good bit of it, in the attempt to establish racial integration in the South. It wasn't until I finally moved to New Jersey, and I don't know why I was pulled there, but I was, and I was visiting a shrine or a memorial to a Quaker, pre-Revolutionary War Quaker, and I went into the house, and it seemed infinitely familiar to me, the déjà vu experience that most of us have had. I put it to one side and continued to go through the house. I came to a window halfway up the stairs, and I felt myself moving into a slightly altered state of consciousness. When I came to the head of the stairs, I saw a bookcase. And when I saw those books, I was drawn to them very, very powerfully. And I reached for this one book, and I remember holding it very gently in my hands, and I went into a reverie state, and I felt myself jogging along on a mule with this book propped up in front of the saddle, and I looked down, and I could see the brown stubble of the field beneath the mule's hoofs, and I could feel the scratchy wool clothing around me, and I remember my feelings of what I was reading. And when I saw the signature on the flyleaf of the book, I had a sense of instant familiarity, almost like a chill running through you. I felt I had been that man and owned that book. I didn't do much about this, but I think that, to be truthful, it was this personal experience that led me into a deep curiosity. Is it true we've lived again? When I found that this Quaker was very active against slavery and that had spent many years working with black slaves, traveling through the South, I again had that kind of chill of recognition. And I linked it up to my experience when I was 13.
You were influenced also by Seth, were you not? Seth being
This experience preceded my acquaintance with Jane Roberts, and it may have been one of the preliminaries to the next step, which was to become friends with Jane, though I can't claim her as a personal friend, but at any rate an acquaintance of Jane. And when I read Seth's book, what he said struck me as being profoundly true. Just before I read the Seth material, I had had a dream. Like many psychologists, I was trained to analyze my own dreams. And I woke up in the middle of the night with a clear awareness that I knew all about reincarnation, that I had known about it in many lifetimes before. And I woke up with a smile on my lips and the feeling, you damn fool, why are you pretending you're learning it for the first time? Right after that, I found Jane's book, The Seth Material, which had just been published the week before.
Perhaps you can tell the audience who Seth is.
Well, Jane Roberts is a writer, a woman of great sensitivity and intelligence, a well-educated woman in Elmira, New York, who, when she was given a contract to write a book on how to develop your ESP and began experimenting on her own for the purpose of the book, discovered that she was a medium. I won't go through the process she went through to discover it. It didn't take long. And before very long, Jane was having books dictated through her. Now, Jane and Seth are not exactly two distinct personalities. This is the way we view it because this is the way we like to think about it. We have a belief system, and in this belief system, Seth has to be a person, and he has to come through a physical person named Jane and use her vocal cords. This is the way we conceive it. I conceive it a little differently, and Jane conceives it a little differently. I think Jane goes into a deep, altered state of consciousness. In this altered state of consciousness, she is able to open the doors to her own subconscious and, using Jung's belief system, move into the collective unconscious. There, other personalities, in quotes, other sources of knowledge are available to her inner mind, and she expresses them. They are expressed in the form of a personality. But as Seth has said, you call me Seth. I have no name. You create me, you who listen and you who read my books. And Jane creates me. And yet, I also am.
So let's pick up the story about your relationship with...
Well, I went up to see Jane. Jane had been under a lot of fire from psychologists who said, well, this is your alter ego and you really want to be a masculine man of knowledge and that's why you've invented Seth. It's very disturbing to a medium to have these nothing but psychological explanations thrown out. which please the analyst but don't reach truth. And I told her I was a clinical psychologist, and I didn't think she was crazy. I thought she was great. So Jane invited me up to Elmira, and I attended her ESP class. And then Jane said that Seth wanted to speak to me individually. And when I talked with Jane, we sat down with a cup of coffee, and Jane was Jane, a very quiet, shy, but charming person. Tiny, with a soft but rapid voice. And then all of a sudden the coffee cup came down, and Seth came through, and Jane threw her head back and her chin out the way she does when Seth comes through. And a large, booming voice came from her mouth and said, "Helen, I want to talk to you." Well, this was pretty impressive, and it rather amused me because most of us in the modern world don't experience awe very often, kneeling at the feet of the god. But this was a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, when the voice of the wizard booms out from the microphone. What Seth wanted to talk to me about was not my hypnotic regression work, which I had already begun. What he wanted to talk about was the work I was doing in my, quote, real life, close quote, which was starting an institution for psychotic and suicidal and seriously delinquent teenagers. And what Seth told me at that time was quite remarkable. He told me about the past lives of some of the children under my care. He made it very clear to me that I must give up notions of rescuing. He said no one rescues any entity. All entities decide for themselves what role they would take. I protested to Seth, and I said, but these kids are the victims of society's abuse, and they've been beaten as children and abandoned. How can you blame their troubles on themselves? And he said, well, they are entities who set up very difficult challenges for themselves. He was also very sympathetic to my method of handling the children, and was most helpful in even such tiny details as how better to arrange the rooms and what kind of facilities to provide. This was a truly psychic experience in that Jane had no awareness or knowledge of the fact that this was my full-time role at the time. She only knew of my interest in parapsychology.
How have some of those ideas from the Seth material influenced your work in hypnotic regression?
Well, this is a technique that Seth calls Alpha 2. Seth says that once one has learned Alpha 1, which can be roughly equated with meditating, then he says it's valuable to go back and follow one's feelings and intuitions and recover some of the experiences one has had in past lives. He said that it's necessary to begin this process slowly and carefully and not to worry too much about scientific proof. What Seth was saying to the people who are interested in doing this was, you will find parts of yourself that you have not known about before, that have not been a part of your conscious self. Make them conscious, explore and expand.
What have you learned about the nature of time through these experiences?
Well, of course, like most beliefs we have, we change our notions only through a long process of experimentation. I realized that time was only a convention that we humans have a long time ago, basically through studying modern physics, or at least being aware of the implications of it. My undergraduate training, I might add, was at the University of Chicago in Hutchins Day, and though I was educated in the scientific tradition, I was also educated in more ancient traditions of humanism and of studying philosophical systems. This meant that I never fully bought the scientific materialist point of view because I was educated to believe that there were competing systems. So notions about the nature of time in my own intellectual life were not as set, perhaps, as someone who hasn't had training in philosophy. Nevertheless, I, like anybody else, believes in time. It took a lot of experiencing for me to become aware that there is nothing but this moment, because all we have of the past are memories and souvenirs. And even the buildings we pass every day, the old Victorian structures in San Francisco, they've been painted up, they've been resurrected, they've been dusted off, but they are not as they were in 1850. Nothing remains of the past, but some material things that we in the eternal now paste onto our version of the past. If I can explore this a little further, what is Stonehenge? Stonehenge is a bunch of stones, big ones, granted. It's a bunch of stones standing, most of them tumbled, in a large plain. Now, presumably, in 500 A.D., these stones were a quarry available to the people of surrounding villages to build their Christian cathedrals with. Around 1200 A.D., they could have been kind of a picnic ground for covens of witches who wished to maintain their old religion. By 1700, they became tourist attractions for Englishmen who would come to Stonehenge and be taught about the human sacrifices that were made by the evil pagan religions. And so the tour guides would show the tourists a stone with a hollowed-out part and say, this is where they cut the throat. And there'd be oohs and ahs on the part of the tourists. So Stonehenge would be an example of evil pagan religions. By the 19th, 20th centuries, Stonehenge became a quaint example of a rather charming rural past in England. Nowadays, people go to Stonehenge and they see an astronomical observatory, because, of course, some of the recent work suggests that that was one of the ways in which it was used. Now, we all go to Stonehenge. What do we see? We see what the belief systems of our eternal now say those stones mean.
Have you experienced, or have your subjects experienced, with simultaneous nature?
Well, I had an interesting case. This comes up quite often. In the first place, people are sacked out on a living room floor somewhere, and they know that it's, say, June 23rd, 1976, but at the same time they're experiencing a life in ancient Persia, a life in 800 in Mexico, and each image seems just as vivid as the other. So this in itself could be an experience of simultaneous time. I once had a very, I guess you'd call him spiritual young man. He was on the path in one of my first workshops in Berkeley. He went under and he recalled a life as a solitary hermit somewhere in northern India, your average standard mountaintop dweller. And I reached him at one point, and then I said, you'll move ahead 5 years. And he said he had the distinct impression that the skinny old man he was at that time, sitting in the mountaintop, said to himself, I've heard that woman's voice before, about 5 years ago. So presumably the old hermit was pretty psychic, and the old hermit knew that I was zapping in on him and that his future self was zapping in on him. So that was an experience of simultaneous time.
You talk about future selves. Can we experience those as well?
Well, perhaps you can. I don't get into it. One reason I don't is because it's impossible to research it. I've got enough problems trying to research the immediate past without trying to research the year 2030. The other reason is that most of the occult masters, or the wisdom of the East, whatever one wants to call the new cosmology, state pretty clearly, don't predict the future, because when you predict it, you are limiting your possibilities. And in that sense, you are living your future before it is time to live your future, and you're limiting your options. So it's primarily for that reason that I don't take people into the future, either their future in this life or another future life. Because if Seth is correct, and we have probable lives, and at any point in the eternal now we can choose many paths, if I should have someone in an altered state, and they choose a future life path at that moment, then they are influencing that future life in a way that limits its possibilities. If they should choose that future life in the future based on more creative experiences, perhaps they would make a better choice.
Helen, I'd like to ask you, you've used the term altered states of consciousness several times. I'd like to ask you, what is an altered state of consciousness?
It's anything except I've got to pay the PG&E bill, and where is 21st and Alabama streets? In other words, we have a kind of an ego gray flannel executive in our head that keeps us moving along properly in whatever reality system we're involved in. As soon as we can shut up this gray flannel executive, then we are in an altered state of consciousness. It can be called daydreaming, and was in my childhood. It was also called not paying attention. However, nowadays it's called meditating, and it's supposed to be good for you. That is one altered state. Drugs obviously put you in other altered states of consciousness. Henry James, or rather William James, his brother, the psychologist, said after taking laughing gas that it seems obvious that there are many forms of consciousness that are just a breath away from us, and we should not close our accounts with reality until we have explored these. And I think that William James is indeed the father of humanistic psychology and parapsychology, because his own drug trips back in Boston in 1860 showed him this.
I just wondered, and the reason I asked that question is that I just wondered if through your work that you have been able to get a little more clarity on different states of consciousness, because the term altered states of consciousness is so broad, and especially in the definition you just gave it, and it implies pretty much at least half of one's life. And I'm wondering if you have any more clarity on the different degrees of consciousness and the different states and the different levels of awareness from your work.
Yes, of course I cannot possibly give you a map. Once we get a map, we'll be in another culture. And this is, to me, the most exciting scientific, cultural advance of the next 5 decades at least, is exploring these altered states and trying to define them in some way, to get crude maps and guideposts. I feel that hypnosis is a special altered state that is different than dreaming, that is different than meditation. And its difference is that the hypnotist's directions focus your attention on specific items, and using your altered state, you can then zero in or zero down on specific things you wish to explore. Most people, when they meditate, are going into a very peaceful state, perhaps some into samadhi, which is the sense of being overwhelmed by the beauty and the oneness of the world. I think people in hypnosis can be brought to that state very easily, but I think its usefulness is that it can focus people when they are floating and drifting, when their potential for remembering and experiencing is at its height. You can get to specific places and get specific impressions that you can then recall. It takes the hypnotic suggestion, you will recall what you experienced, to bring the reincarnational memories to the fore in the subjects in my groups and workshops. Without this, people tend to go so deep that the only way that you can get the information is to question them under hypnosis and then play the tape later. I soon discovered that it was quite easy to send people into deep trances, and that when they were under, it was easy to question them and get answers. But you often get one-syllable answers. You get rather vague answers. Because a hypnotized person doesn't like to be distracted when they're in a past life. They like to experience it fully. And they see the hypnotist's questions as a irritating interruption, much as we would when we're watching a good TV show and somebody says, "What happened?" I found that if I told my subjects they would recall, that then they would describe the trip to me with much more vividness, and that they would recall a lot of their thoughts about the trip as well as the visual images of the trip. This is different than other states of consciousness. Unless someone is tripping and has a guide with them, I don't mean an astral guide, I mean someone who is straight, sitting there and talking with them and taking notes, most people do not remember the full details of their trip. They just remember specific parts of it. So to me, hypnosis is a marvelous and delightful tool because it enables you to zero in, to record, and to get a lasting impression of something that's experienced.
Helen, you've taken people through the death experience as well as the birth experience under hypnosis. Can you talk a little bit about how people experience death, what you've learned about death?
Oh, I could talk a lot about it. That's the really exciting thing. It might be one reason I got into this, because once I slid on the wrong side of 45, somehow death became a more interesting subject for speculation than it had been before. What I have found is precisely the same type of experiencing during death and after death that is reported in people who have been clinically dead and then revived, in people who have been in accidents, critically injured, and have had out-of-body experiences. The evidence is really piling up, and I think it's quite significant evidence. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the author of Death and Dying, has collected 1,000 reports of the death experience in seriously ill or injured people, and it seems to be the same as my findings. And I have now taken over 1,400 people through the death experience in past lives. What is reported is that at the moment of death, there seems to be a very calm acceptance of the fact that death is to occur. After death, it seems to be a rather indeterminate time when the spirit leaves the body. An interesting case of this was a young man who was dying of tuberculosis and apparently had a high fever. This was a death in 1922. Incidentally, many of the facts of that past life were proved out on research. But he was delirious, and he said he didn't know quite when he died because he had been in and out of his body for some time prior to the final separation. So the moment of death is a little difficult to determine, but it seems to be when the person floats up out of their body. Some people describe it as a very sharp, sudden experience, like a pop. Other people describe themselves as floating up. But however they seem to come out of their body, and most people apparently come out of the solar plexus with a healthy minority coming out of the crown of their heads, they look back on the physical body, and the feeling that they express quite frequently is one of deep relief. It has been expressed to me by subjects as being, thank God I'm going home again. It is a feeling of release, a feeling of no longer being imprisoned in a tiny, limited body in a tiny, limited world. One very articulate subject, I think, put it best to me. He was in World War I. This is another case where a good deal of the data checked out. He was on the front in France. A shell came. It exploded. He left his body immediately. I said, look down on your body. And he said, I haven't got one. Apparently it was blown to bits. And then he threw back his head and he laughed. And he laughed and he laughed and he laughed. And I was a little concerned about him. This is one of the first regressions I had done. And when he stopped laughing, he said, of course, it's a game. How could I ever have taken it seriously? And I asked him what he meant by this, and he said, well, of course having a body is just something you do. I'm very glad to be out of that one. He then went on to describe where he was. He said he was floating. He was seeing other people he had known before who had died. And then he said, you know, the feeling is like being a drop of water. And it's so much better to be a drop of water in the ocean than a drop of water in a tiny bucket. And that's what being alive is, being in a body is. It's being in a little bucket, a little confined space. You can do a lot in that confined space, and it's a great place to learn. I asked if he wanted to have another body, and he said, no, I don't want to be confined again. But then he said, you know, the experience is I can be everywhere at once. I can be anything I like. There are no limits on me. And there was a long pause, and I asked him more. This is one of the few subjects that I really inquired deeply about the after-death experience. And he said, you know, having different bodies is like having the same music come out through different speakers. And each lifetime is a different speaker, which picks up different tones. He said, but the music is the same. I am the same. I just make different speakers for myself. I thought that was a rather beautiful description. Now, I have some statistics here. I'm fond of statistics. They make me feel very centered and proper, and like a psychologist ought to be. So while I have all these people down on the floor going through all their traumas and delights of past lives, I'm sitting there taking little records. And I ask people what they're experiencing after death. And of my group, of this particular group, there were approximately 400 past life trips. And in this group, 60% of them expressed a feeling of calm and a feeling of acceptance, a feeling of freedom and release after death. Another 20% experienced real joy and transcendence. Their experience of death was, it's marvelous. Another 15% were sad or angry or regretful. This is immediately after death. And when I broke that down and looked at the cases where they did express this, most of these deaths were either women in childbirth who apparently feel very badly about leaving helpless children behind, or people who died violently in war and who expressed a lot of feeling wanting to continue whatever it was they were doing while they were killed, and a feeling of having been stopped in the middle of a task, unable to complete whatever they were on earth doing. Only 3% expressed surprise at death, and this is a surprising finding in itself. Only 3% of my subjects felt that the experience after death came as a surprise. It seems as though most people, 80%, of the people that I've hypnotized, directly under the level of consciousness, are not at all afraid of death. Indeed, they welcome it. And if this finding holds true for another 1,000 subjects, I think I've really got a hold of something. We are not afraid of death. This is something our society's imposed on us.
Might we be afraid of annihilation?
This would be my philosophical thought. Presumably we're afraid of becoming nothing. There's no such experience of becoming nothing after death. As my articulate subject said, I'm a drop of water and I'm in the ocean, but I maintain my own individuality. What surprises me is that all these people had such an occult, mystical, and yoga-type attitude towards death, even though consciously they weren't aware of it.
What about birth?
Now birth is something else again. Now, most people resist being born, which amused me. In our culture, birth is a reason for celebration, and death is a reason for sorrow. But for the people who are brought to the time just before they are to be born, I ask them, first, do you choose to be born? And a slight majority said, yes, I want to be born. 46%, however, said very definitely, no, I don't choose to be born, I just have to. The attitude towards the prospect of being born seems to be one of the same attitude we all have when we have to go back to school and take physics this year. It's a great deal like the attitude of having to go to work after a vacation. The feeling some people have is one of resistance to it to such a degree that they see themselves being pushed into the fetus. I don't quite know who does the pushing. Most people report there seems to be some kind of committee up there who tells you or decides for you or helps you choose what lifetime, what fetus to move into, and tells you now is the time, don't hang back. One girl described it to me as like you're going out on a high diving board, and you know you can make the dive, but it's hard and you don't want to do it, and you stand there at the edge of the board and finally somebody pushes you, and swoosh, you're in. Another person described it as, I was hovering around the fetus, she said, and I looked down and I said, I can't get in that little tiny thing. I'm not going to limit myself like that. But all of a sudden, zap, in she was. And so I've got a picture now of birth as being sent down a chute into a narrow little confined prison or tiny schoolroom where we have to learn a lot of lessons. And at death, then, is, last day of school vacation. Now, 50% of my group did have committees helping them choose to be born.
Committees?
Well, now and then I'll get someone who said a person was helping me, but quite often it's more than one. So apparently there's a lot of group activity up there in the old astral plane, or however you want to conceive of it. Now, most people in my group found it difficult to experience the birth canal experience very vividly. 50% did have very vivid birth experiences moving through the canal, which is described in various ways. Many people just seem to slip out. Other people feel a good deal of constriction as they move down the birth canal. 50% of my subjects made the experience rather vague. They didn't want to get into it that deeply. Well, I was curious about the problem of when does the spirit enter the body of the baby. After all, we have a lot of arguments about abortion, and it's a pretty good point. Well, now my figures show that only 24% of my group attached themselves to the fetus during gestation. Now, among these 24% were some lively characters. I remember one who was zapped in almost at the moment of conception, and he said that was because he was very attracted to the sexual life of his parents, and he wanted to be in there all the time. Apparently waiting for Saturday night, or however you want to phrase it. Another subject said that she went into the fetus because it was so nice and warm and squirmy and peaceful in there, and she just sort of dug it. So there is a minority of 24% who say, okay, the fetus is growing, I'll pop in and experience life through the fetus. The fairly large group, the largest group, had no feeling of attachment prior to birth. They just sort of ignored the fetus and apparently hung out on the diving board, so to speak, until they were pushed into it. That was 42%. Another 14% came into the fetus just before the birth. They waited to the last possible moment and then zapped in and moved down the birth canal with it. The fairly sizable group, 18%, were in and out of the fetus before birth. These, I noticed, were often the people who chose to be born, and they described the experience as coming in and sort of checking the fetus and urging on its growth and seeing how it was growing and zapping right back out again. So that's how people experience the birth. Now, I ask a question, and it's a pretty potent question. I say, do you know who your parents will be? Have you known them in past lives? And is this one reason you've chosen to be born? 64% of my subjects are aware of karmic ties before birth. These are not just to the parents, but to other people they will meet. To my astonishment, however, quite a few of these are fairly distant ties, like, well, I knew my cousin before, or my father was my sister in a past life. I didn't find a large series of karmic attachments. It might be because they didn't give them enough time to be aware of all of them. However, 35% were not aware of karmic ties before birth. You can state either that they're not into believing in karmic ties, or perhaps they didn't have karmic ties. They simply moved to a body when one became available, regardless of planning. One of my most interesting experiences of subjects in the birth process, I was doing a regression with some professional people, and not in San Francisco, and one of the subjects in whose home the workshop was being held was going through the birth experience, and the telephone rang. Someone else answered the phone. I could hear a little of the conversation. Apparently, someone was saying, "Is she all right?" And the person was answering, "Oh, yes, she's being hypnotized. Can't disturb her now. No, she's fine." When I brought the subjects out, the psychologist being hypnotized said that she was in the birth canal and she was resistant to coming out and being born, but that her twin sister, who was the one who really wanted this lifetime and who talked her into sharing it with her, being a twin with her, was urging her to come out of the birth canal and expressing a good deal of anxiety about the subject being stuck in the birth canal or not wanting to join the body, not wanting to stay alive. The telephone call that had come exactly 2 seconds after I had gotten them born was from the twin sister in Alabama who had gotten a sudden psychic hunch that something was wrong with her sister who was expressing resistance or pain. Now, this I thought was a quite remarkable telepathic coincidence. The subject said that her sister didn't call her all that often, and that apparently somehow a psychic message had been exchanged between these twins. And as my subject thought about her twin and the fact that the lifetime was designed for her twin and she was a reluctant partner, had been picked up by the twin.
Helen, recently, in the last few years, Arthur Janoff and most recently Frederick Le Boyer have made large numbers of people aware of the fact that birth was a painful experience. What do your findings say?
Oh, they support it completely. I ask what they're experiencing right after birth, and they say cold, light, yuck, ugh. I've had some pleasant births, and they're generally in quiet, dark, safe, home-like situations. I think that there's little doubt at all, from my research and from that of a number of other people who are regressing people to the birth experience, such as Est, that we're really doing a lot of harm to kids by bringing them into this super antiseptic atmosphere. But I think we ought to accept the fact that we did stop a lot of deaths in childbirth because of the antisepsis introduced in hospitals. And it's almost as though now we have conquered this, it's time to look to the infant's needs. But I think my data shows that an astonishingly high number of women died in childbirth in the past. My figures are about 10% of the natural deaths occurred in childbirth. So, though I'm 100% for Le Boyer, I think we ought to realize that this is an advance based on a necessary previous advance, which is saving the life of the mother.
What about the manipulations of the doctor on the child, the things that the infant experiences right after birth?
Well, I just ask them what they experience, and I don't leave them in it long because it's so unpleasant. So I don't get a lot of detail on that. Some do describe being held and that this is comforting. But most of them simply describe the pain of the light. I would say dimming the lights is number one, and providing some warm kind of wrapping would be number two, to protect the infant from the cold feeling on the skin.
What about a mother under anesthesia? Is there any difference?
Oddly, I haven't got any results on that, and I do ask people, are you aware of the emotions and attitudes of your mother just prior to birth? And I get answers on that quite a lot, and I'm sure a lot of the mothers were anesthetized, but apparently their emotions and attitudes came through to their infant.
So there's communication?
Apparently, yes. Again, trying to establish this as an objective fact is pretty damn difficult. I have asked some people who have had specific birth experiences, such as a leg being very painful, and then the person realizing that indeed they did have a damaged leg at birth, which was corrected by 2 months of age. This kind of, some kind of objective discovery of whether or not what was experienced at birth actually did happen as perceived by other people has proved out, but of course most of the cases have never been checked back. So you understand that when I'm giving all this, I'm giving what people tell me under hypnosis. I'm not stating that this is some total truth. But apparently, a lot of evidence shows that when people are anesthetized, they are simply being pushed out of their body by the drug, and they remain aware of what's going on around them. I was at the National Conference of the Institute of Clinical Hypnosis 2 years ago, and I met a pathologist from a hospital a large teaching hospital in St. Louis, who said he'd been doing research in hypnotizing people who had been anesthetized under surgery. And he was getting nearly 100% recall of the entire surgical procedure under hypnosis of patients who, of course, were knocked out totally. Which makes one wonder, what is anesthesia? It simply is a dimming of the recollections, perhaps. But the mind or the spirit or the experiencing I, the person, is apparently still present under anesthesia, or at least aware at 2 levels of the experience. So I imagine that we've all had out-of-body experiences if we've ever been knocked out with an anesthesia. Interesting thought. By the way, this pathologist said that he was having a hard time convincing anesthesiologists of his findings because it sort of horrified them to think that everything they said and everything the surgeon said would be remembered at some level by the patient.
Helen, you've been saying a lot of interesting things and thought-provoking things and very curious information. Provokes curiosity. I'm wondering, with all of the information you've been providing, how does it relate to the spiritual search and the idea of a God, of a higher source? Has that come out in any of your past life readings to any great degree?
Oh, of course, and it comes out in many different ways. The same person will die 3 times in the course of a day's workshop. Pretty busy workshop. You get dead 3 times and get born once. And the same person will die within different religious contexts. I had one who was a Christian monk in 1200 and died in full sanctity, proper old age, believed he was going to heaven, and did. And in the next life, he was an Arab wine merchant who hung around with a lot of dancing girls, died because the wine shipment was hijacked, was knocked off by the hijacker, made off with the wine, and drifted up with no consciousness of meeting the Virgin Mary or anybody
Somehow
else.
I have this image of this sanctified monk thinking about dancing girls.
Right. Well, the same. What is it? The speaker is different, but the music is the same. Well, then he was the young man who died of tuberculosis. And there he floated into a kind of a notion of infinity when he died. So here is the same human being who, in his conscious waking life, is a scientific materialist who has no belief in life after death. One time he's a good Christian, one time he's a good Muslim, and the next time he's a modern, kind of deeply poetic young man who dies poetically and goes into the universe. So it's really fascinating. I have everybody take at least 3 trips and 3 deaths. Because I think when people just do this once and they have one past life recall, they get a distorted notion of themselves. Most people who don't believe in reincarnation express the feeling, I made this all up. Because, of course, it comes from their own mind. And we've all been taught that there are 2 different aspects. One is real and the other is your imagination. So if people have a death and they think, well, this is what I really think about death, then they have the second death and they say, well, I must really think that about death, too. And then they have the third death, and they say, what's going on here? We're less likely to limit our notions of ourselves by experiencing more than one past life. I've forgotten your question. I don't know what the hell it
Well,
was.
it's fairly unimportant. I just asked you what it had to do with God and the spiritual
Oh,
search.
yes. The question was, have I got the answer to it all? And what is absolute truth? How could I forget a question like that? Well, we all have our notions, and right now I'm enamored of one. I'm sure that this truth shall pass away also, like all other truths. And I see it visually, and I see everybody as this little wave of quantum particles sort of floating gaily through the universe, gathering little particles unto itself, and a little glittering, gleaming magnetic field around itself, and it sort of moves very rapidly. It sends little gleaming, glittering magnetic pseudopods out to other particles who are passing through also, and we call this getting together or tuning in on somebody else. And that, in essence, everything that we consider real around us is a projection from our mind. There is only one reality that modern science knows, and that is particles moving in waves. There's no atom, there's no molecule, there is no building block of matter. Whenever you reach down to find out what's really true and what's really material, it fades in your hands and it turns into a wave. So, as scientific materialists advanced into the 20th century, and they tried to grip the hard facts, and the hard facts slipped out, and now the only thing we can really say is what goes up must come down, and that everything moves in waves. So, I believe that what we do is we're giant projection machines in that sense. We project onto the quantum particles of the universe these magnificent scenarios, these magnificent stage sets that we call reality. Reality, of course, is only a little pie-shaped segment of energy moving within the speed of light squared. E equals mc squared. Einstein said it. So we just live in a little bitty part of the spectrum of energy, and we call it real. We call this table real, this microphone real. But what's real is my voice and the fact that it's coming out through a sound wave to everyone listening to me. And so we have so transcended material life now with our technological discoveries that we can finally realize we are only spirit. We are only imagination. And that is the only reality we can ever know. And I think that the lives we have and the bodies we construct for ourselves, the mountains that we make, and the telepathic agreements we all come to when we decide to move into this stage set that's called The World 1976, what we do is we have a drama. And we put on costumes, and we call those costumes bodies. We make those bodies out of the quantum stuff of the universe. There is no single particle of your body that was here yesterday. You see? It's all waves moving. I think cells are lower forms of consciousness that agree to cooperate with us. And they say, hey, that's fun, let's play, let's make a body. Okay, you want this body, we'll make it. And I think we dress ourselves in the costume of a body, and we paint these stage sets that are called the Pacific Ocean or the Peninsula. And I think we play out a moral drama on the stage with this scenario. And I think we don't have karma. I don't think that we have to pay in this life for sins in the past life. I think what we do is we're in a repertory company. And when we're on this stage and we have a play that's a moral play, we each have to play every part until we understand its emotional reverberations completely and totally. We have to be Desdemona, we have to be Othello, we have to be Iago. And most of the time we have to be spear carriers or choruses in the drama. And I think that we do this joyously and creatively. I think we accept the limitations of our stage set and accept the limitations of our clumsy costume because this is the best way to act out the moral drama. I think that sometimes we build new stage sets to act out the same moral drama because it didn't work out too well. And I think a lot of people in this country in this day and age are acting out a drama of tyranny and conquest. And I think that empire building is one stage play, and perhaps many people who have some measure of power in America were perhaps actors on the stage in the Roman Empire actors on the stage in the Turkish Empire. And so there are times when we get off stage. There are times when we no longer have to be on the stage. We get a break, and we leave the stage set, and we call it dying. And we say, and we wipe off our makeup, and we drop our costume, and we sit backstage, and we have a drink, and we hang around with our friends. And then we think, well, we got to get back on stage. I've got a new idea for a new part. I'm going to put in these lines at this point in Act 2. And so we put on another costume, and we move in, and we act out the drama. And that's the parable, if you will. But that's the truth as I see it at this time, and with whatever insights I've been able to get. I suspect it'll be different tomorrow.
And God?
Well, He is us. What is the old phrase, I have met the enemy, and he is me? Well, once you go and you finally come up to this masterful God, into this wonderful beingness, into this final samadhi, and you've passed all of the gargoyles that are guarding the path to God, and damn it, He's right there inside you and has been all along, and He's been traveling on the spiritual path with you, laughing up a storm as you keep looking for Him outside of yourself. And every time you run into a guru or a truly godly man and you follow him, I'm sure the God inside you laughs again.